A billionaire sees his ex holding a baby at the airport. When he discovers it's his, chaos and love collide. Hi, my beautiful family. It's your Mr. Peter. And to those visiting for the very first time, welcome to a corner of the world where love never runs out. This isn't just a story channel. It's a place where broken hearts rest, where kindness speaks, and where your soul is never alone. Before we begin, I want to give you something, not a gift you hold, but one you feel, a prayer that comes straight from the deepest part of my heart. May every crack in your soul be filled with light. May the battles you don't speak of be won in silence. May peace come to you like a mother's embrace, gentle, safe, and lasting. I pray that joy returns to you in quiet waves, that love finds you when you least expect it, and that no tear you've cried is ever wasted. You are not forgotten. You are not broken. You are a masterpiece, still becoming, still rising, still worthy of everything good. Now, my beautiful family, please don't walk away from this story halfway. It was born in my heart, with you in mind, every word stitched with love. And when it ends, I ask softly, rate it out of 10 in the comments, not for numbers, but so I can feel you, hear you, stay close to you. If you don't, I'll quietly mind, not out of pride, but out of love. Please like this video, leave a word that feels true, share it with someone whose heart needs a home. Let's keep this family strong, a sanctuary of grace, truth, and endless love. Let's begin the story. With all my love, always.
Destiny has a twisted sense of timing, and Tim Ahlstrom was about to discover just how merciless fate could be when it decided to upend a perfectly ordered life in 30 seconds. The Denver International Airport hummed with its usual symphony of rolling luggage, crying babies, and hurried conversations in a dozen languages. Tim moved through the terminal like a man who owned the world, which, in many ways, he did. His custom-tailored charcoal suit hugged his athletic frame perfectly, the kind of precision-cut Italian wool that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. At 32, Timothy Ahlstrom commanded a tech empire worth $1.2 billion, his face gracing the covers of Forbes and Fortune with enviable regularity. His phone buzzed against his ear as he strode toward gate B15, his personal assistant Elena rattling off tomorrow's board meeting details. The acquisition of MindBridge Technologies had proceeded flawlessly, another victory in his relentless march toward market dominance. His reflection in the terminal's glass walls showed a man who possessed everything: a sharp jawline, emerald eyes that missed nothing, and the confident stride that made lesser men step aside without conscious thought. "Sir, the car will be waiting at baggage claim level 3, Elena's voice crackled through his AirPods. "And don't forget, you have dinner with the Kowalski group at 8. Tim barely heard her. Something had shifted in his peripheral vision, a flash of cornflower blue that made his heart stutter like a car engine on a cold morning. He turned his head slightly, still walking, still listening to Elena's efficiency reports, when it happened. The collision was inevitable, physics and fate conspiring in perfect harmony. Tim's shoulder caught someone moving perpendicular to his path, sending papers and a small purse flying across the polished terminal floor like autumn leaves in a sudden gust. His phone skittered away, Elena's voice cutting off mid-sentence about quarterly projections. "Oh God, I'm so sorry," he began, automatically reaching for the scattered belongings, his mind still processing what had happened. A woman's hand touched his as they both reached for the same fallen paper, and the contact sent electricity shooting through his nervous system with the intensity of a lightning strike. He looked up. Jacques Canepa knelt beside him on the cold terminal floor, her dark hair falling like a curtain around her face as she gathered her scattered documents. 4 years, 4 years, 3 months, and 16 days since he'd last seen that face, since he'd last watched those full lips form his name, since he'd last drowned in eyes the color of rich coffee with flecks of gold that seemed to hold entire galaxies. Time stopped. The airport noise faded to a whisper. His chest constricted as if someone had reached inside and squeezed his heart with an iron fist. Jacques, he breathed, her name falling from his lips like a prayer he'd forgotten he knew. She froze, her fingers clutching a boarding pass so tightly the paper crumpled. Slowly, as if afraid of what she might find, she raised her eyes to meet his. The recognition hit her like a physical blow. He could see it in the way her pupils dilated, in the sharp intake of breath that made her chest rise beneath that simple blue dress that somehow made her look more beautiful than any designer gown ever could. Tim. His name on her lips was barely a whisper, carrying 4 years of pain, longing, and carefully buried love. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, kneeling on the airport floor like supplicants at the altar of their shared past. She was even more beautiful than his memory had preserved, her skin still that gorgeous shade of deep amber that had made him think of sunset and honey, her cheekbones sharp enough to cut his heart all over again. But there was something different about her now, a maturity in her eyes, a strength that spoke of battles fought and survived alone. "Mama, you dropped Mr. Bear." The small voice shattered the spell like a rock through stained glass. Tim's head snapped toward the sound, and his entire world tilted off its axis. A little boy stood beside Jacques, clutching a worn teddy bear with one missing eye. The child couldn't have been more than 3, with café au lait skin and a serious expression that was achingly familiar. But it was the eyes that stopped Tim's heart completely. Emerald green, exactly like his own, exactly like his father's and his grandfather's before him. The distinctive Alstrom eyes that had been passed down through 5 generations of men who had built empires and broken hearts in equal measure. The child's face was a perfect miniature version of Tim's own childhood photos, the same strong jaw softened by youth, the same stubborn cowlick that refused to be tamed, the same way of tilting his head when studying something carefully. Even the way the boy held himself, with a quiet confidence beyond his years, was purely Alstrom. "Jaime, stay close," Jacques said quickly, her voice tight with panic as she realized what Tim was seeing, what he was understanding with devastating clarity. Jaime, his son, his son. The math was simple and brutal. The boy appeared to be about 3 years old. 4 years ago, the last night he and Jacques had been together, they had made love with desperate passion, 2 people sensing they were saying goodbye. She had been luminous in the moonlight streaming through his penthouse windows, her skin radiant, her touch igniting him completely. They had been careless in their need for each other, lost in consuming desire that made rational thought impossible. Tim's hands trembled as he slowly stood, his legs threatening to buckle for the first time since childhood. Jacques scrambled to her feet as well, instinctively placing herself between Tim and Jaime in a gesture that was both protective and heartbreaking. "He's mine," Tim said, the words falling from his lips like stones into still water, creating ripples that would change everything. It wasn't a question. The resemblance was too strong, the timing too perfect, the truth too undeniable. Jacques' face went pale, her breathing quick and shallow. "Tim, please. He's my son." Tim's voice was stronger now, filled with wonder and rage, and a joy so intense it felt like drowning. "My God, Jacques, he's my son, and you never told me." People were starting to stare now, sensing the drama unfolding in their midst. Airport security would probably approach soon if the tension got any thicker. Jacques seemed to realize this too, her eyes darting around nervously. "I have to go," she whispered, taking Jaime's hand. "Our flight—" "No." The word came out with the force of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "No, you're not running away again, not this time." But she was already moving, scooping up her remaining belongings with practiced efficiency, lifting Jaime into her arms with the fluid grace of a mother who had done this 1,000 times. The boy looked over her shoulder at Tim as they hurried away, those familiar green eyes wide with curiosity and an intelligence that took Tim's breath away. "Mama, who was that man?" he heard Jaime ask as they disappeared into the crowd. Tim stood frozen in the middle of the bustling terminal, his entire world cracked open like an egg. Around him, life continued its normal rhythm. Flights boarding, lovers reuniting, business travelers checking emails. But for Tim Ahlstrom, nothing would ever be normal again. He had a son, a beautiful, perfect son who didn't know his name, who called another woman Mama, and had spent 3 years of life without knowing his father existed. The realization hit him like a physical blow, doubling him over with the intensity of loss and rage and love all tangled together into something too big for his chest to contain. His phone buzzed at his feet where it had fallen. Elena's voice emerged tinny and distant. "Sir? Sir, are you there? The Kowalski meeting?" Tim reached down and ended the call with trembling fingers. The Kowalski group could wait. The board meeting could wait. His entire billion-dollar empire could wait. He had a son to find. Chapter 2. The Love That Burned Too Bright. Love had never been part of Tim Ahlstrom's business plan until the night it ambushed him in the most unexpected place and rewrote the blueprint of his carefully orchestrated life. 5 years earlier, Tim had been 27 and absolutely certain he understood the world's rules. Success was a formula. Work 18-hour days, forge strategic alliances, eliminate weaknesses, and never let emotion cloud judgment. Love was a luxury he couldn't afford, a distraction that had destroyed lesser men. He'd built his first company at 22, sold it for $50 million at 25, and was rapidly approaching his first billion. Romance was for people who had time to waste. The Meridian Gallery's opening night was supposed to be another networking opportunity, another chance to be seen with the right people while scouting potential investments in emerging technologies. The invitation had mentioned something about revolutionary digital art installations, which sounded expensive enough to warrant his attention. Tim arrived fashionably late, his black Tom Ford tuxedo immaculate, his charm turned to its most lethal setting. The gallery hummed with the usual crowd, tech moguls displaying their cultural sophistication, art collectors hunting for the next big thing, society wives dripping in diamonds that caught the carefully placed lighting. Tim worked the room with practiced ease, his conversation peppered with just enough art knowledge to impress, without revealing how little he actually cared about anything that couldn't be quantified in profit margins. Then he saw her. Jacques Canepa stood before a massive digital canvas that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, colors shifting and flowing like liquid emotion. She wasn't dressed to impress, a simple black dress that hugged her curves modestly, minimal jewelry, hair pulled back in an elegant chignon that emphasized the graceful line of her neck. But there was something about the way she moved, the complete focus in her dark eyes as she studied the piece, that made Tim forget his own agenda. "Spectacular, isn't it?" he heard himself saying, moving to stand beside her without conscious thought. Up close, she was even more breathtaking, skin like warm satin, lips that begged to be kissed, and an intelligence in her gaze that seemed to see straight through his carefully constructed facade. "It's manipulative," she replied without looking at him, her voice carrying a hint of an accent he couldn't place. "The artist is using color psychology to trigger emotional responses rather than letting the piece speak for itself. It's beautiful, but it's not honest." Tim blinked, completely thrown off balance. In his world, people agreed with him, flattered him, told him what they thought he wanted to hear. "I'm sorry." Now she turned to face him, and Tim felt the air leave his lungs in a rush. Her eyes were the color of rich espresso, flecked with gold that seemed to dance in the gallery's artful lighting. "You said it was spectacular. I'm explaining why it's not." She tilted her head, studying him with the same intensity she'd given the artwork. You don't actually care about art, do you? I... What makes you say that? Tim felt heat rising in his cheeks, a sensation he hadn't experienced since middle school. The way you looked at me instead of the piece when you approached. The generic compliment designed to start conversation rather than engage with the work. The fact that you're wearing a Patek Philippe that costs more than most people's annual salary to a charity event, supporting struggling artists. Her lips curved in the ghost of a smile. Also, you've been standing here for 3 minutes and haven't once actually looked at the installation. Tim found himself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in years. You're absolutely right. I know nothing about art. I'm here because my assistant thought it would be good for my image. He extended his hand. Tim Ahlstrom, complete cultural Philistine. Jacques Canepa, the gallery's new curator and occasional caller-outer of cultural Philistines. Her handshake was firm, confident, and sent electricity shooting through his nervous system. At least you're honest about it. It's a character flaw I'm working on, Tim replied, and was rewarded with a genuine smile that made his heart skip like a stone across water. What followed was the most extraordinary conversation of Tim's life. Jacques led him through the gallery, not to network or impress, but to truly see the art for what it was. She spoke about each piece with passion and knowledge that transformed paint and pixels into windows into the human soul. Under her guidance, Tim began to understand that art wasn't just decoration for rich people's walls. It was revolution, communication, the distillation of everything that made humans more than just biological machines. This one, Jacques said, stopping before a simple charcoal sketch of a woman's hands, was drawn by a homeless veteran. She traded it for a meal. The gallery owner almost threw it away before I convinced him to frame it. Tim stared at the drawing, really looked at it. The hands were weathered, scarred, but there was something beautiful in their strength, their endurance. It's incredible. She is. Art isn't about money or status, Tim. It's about truth. It's about showing the world what it means to be alive, to suffer, to hope, to love. Jacques' voice was soft but fierce, and Tim found himself leaning closer to catch every word. And what do you know about love? The question slipped out before he could stop it, too personal, too revealing. Jacques turned to face him fully, and in her eyes, Tim saw depths he wanted to spend a lifetime exploring. I know it's the only thing that matters. Everything else, money, success, power, it's all just noise if you don't have someone to share it with. The rest of the evening blurred together in a haze of connection and discovery. They talked until the gallery closed, then moved to an all-night diner where Jacques ordered coffee and pie, while Tim, who hadn't eaten anything not prepared by a five-star chef in years, found himself savoring greasy eggs and hash browns because she made everything taste like possibility. She told him about growing up in New Orleans, the daughter of a jazz musician father and a social worker mother who taught her that wealth meant nothing if you didn't use it to lift others up. Her passion for art had led her through galleries in Paris and New York before bringing her to Denver, where she was determined to make high culture accessible to everyone, not just the elite. Tim found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone, his loneliness despite being surrounded by people, his fear that he was building an empire with no real foundation, his secret dream of creating something that mattered beyond profit margins. Jacques listened without judgment, asked questions that made him think, challenged assumptions he didn't even know he held. "You're not happy," she said, as dawn began to paint the sky pink outside the diner's windows. "I'm successful," Tim replied automatically. "That's not what I asked." Her hand covered his on the table, warm and soft, and somehow making him feel more grounded than he'd ever been. Success and happiness aren't the same thing, are they? Tim looked down at their joined hands, at the contrast between her artist's fingers, paint still under her nails despite the formal event, and his manicured perfection. No, he admitted quietly, they're not. The first kiss happened in the parking lot as the sun rose over the mountains, tentative and sweet and earth-shattering all at once. Tim had kissed plenty of women, models, actresses, socialites who moved in his circles, but nothing had prepared him for the way Jacques' lips felt against his, soft and warm, and tasting like coffee and promises. "This is crazy," she whispered against his mouth. "Completely insane," he agreed, then kissed her again because not kissing her was impossible. Their courtship was a whirlwind of stolen moments and growing passion. Tim would cancel board meetings to walk through art galleries with Jacques, listening to her explain the stories behind each piece. She introduced him to a world beyond quarterly reports and stock prices, poetry readings in coffee shops, community theater productions, volunteer work at homeless shelters that opened his eyes to lives he'd never considered. In return, Tim showed Jacques possibilities she'd never imagined. Weekend trips to his mountain cabin where they made love under star-filled skies, private concerts by musicians she'd only dreamed of meeting, the resources to fund art programs for underprivileged children that made her eyes light up with joy. "You're changing me," Tim told her one night as they lay tangled in silk sheets, moonlight painting silver patterns on their skin. "You're changing yourself," Jacques corrected, tracing circles on his chest with her fingertip. "I'm just giving you permission to be who you really are underneath all that armor." But love, Tim learned, was more complicated than any business deal he'd ever navigated. Jacques' family was less than thrilled with their relationship. Her traditional Catholic parents struggled with their daughter dating outside her race, while her brother questioned Tim's motives and her friends worried she was being used as an exotic plaything by a rich white man. Tim tried to win them over with expensive gifts and grand gestures, not understanding that his wealth was exactly what made them suspicious. Jacques tried to explain that her family needed to see his heart, not his bank account, but Tim was used to money solving every problem, opening every door. The cracks began to show when work demanded more of Tim's time. A hostile takeover attempt on one of his companies required his full attention for weeks. Important dinners with Jacques' family were cancelled for emergency board meetings. Romantic weekends were postponed for crisis management sessions. "I feel like I'm losing you to that world again," Jacques said one night when Tim arrived, 2 hours late for dinner, his phone still buzzing with urgent messages. "You're not losing me," Tim insisted, pulling her into his arms. "This is just temporary. Once I handle this crisis, there's always going to be another crisis, Tim. There's always going to be another deal, another emergency, another reason why your empire comes first." Her voice was quiet but firm. "I need to know that sometimes I'll come first, that sometimes we'll come first." Tim kissed her forehead, breathing in the scent of her hair. "You do come first. You know you do." But even as he said the words, his phone was buzzing in his pocket, and they both knew which one he would answer first when push came to shove. The love that had burned so bright between them was about to be tested by the one thing Tim had never learned to conquer: the balance between ambition and the human heart. Chapter 3. The night. Everything broke. Some nights shatter everything, and Jacques Canepa would remember this one for the rest of her life. The night love died and hope was buried alongside the man who had taught her that jazz could heal any wounded heart. The pregnancy test lay on the marble counter of Tim's penthouse bathroom like a small plastic oracle, two pink lines declaring a truth that would reshape every plan, every dream, every carefully constructed expectation she'd built for her future. Jacques stared at it with shaking hands, her breath fogging the mirror as she tried to process what this meant. Pregnant. 6 weeks, if her calculations were correct. 6 weeks since that incredible night when she and Tim had made love with desperate intensity, when she'd felt so connected to him that she couldn't tell where she ended and he began. They'd been careless, lost in passion, and the illusion that love could conquer practical concerns like birth control and timing, and the fact that they'd never actually discussed whether children fit into their complicated dance of ambition and romance. Jacques? You okay in there? Tim's voice carried through the door, warm with concern and exhaustion. He'd been working 18-hour days for the past month, orchestrating the merger between his company and Nakamura Industries, a deal that would make him the youngest billionaire in Colorado and cement his reputation as a visionary in the tech world. I'm fine, she called back, her voice steadier than she felt. Just give me a minute. But she wasn't fine. Nothing was fine. Her father was dying. The call had come that morning while Tim was locked in emergency sessions with his lawyers. Louis Canepa, the man who had filled Jacques' childhood with saxophone melodies and stories about music's transformative power, was hospitalized with pneumonia that his weakened lungs couldn't fight. The doctors were gentle but clear. It was a matter of days, not weeks. Jacques had tried calling Tim, but his assistant Elena had been diplomatically ruthless. Mr. Alstrom is in critical negotiations and cannot be disturbed for any reason. I can take a message. It's about my father, Jacques had pleaded. He's dying. I'm very sorry to hear that, Ms. Canepa. I'll make sure Mr. Alstrom gets the message as soon as possible. That had been 8 hours ago. Tim still didn't know. And now, staring at the pregnancy test that would complicate everything infinitely more, Jacques felt the walls of her perfect life crumbling around her like a house of cards in a hurricane. She walked out of the bathroom to find Tim on his laptop at the dining table, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice animated as he discussed stock options and market projections with someone in Tokyo. He looked up when she entered, his green eyes bright with excitement, and held up one finger in the universal gesture for just one more minute. Jacques sat on the couch, the pregnancy test hidden in her palm, and waited. The penthouse around her was beautiful in the way that only unlimited money could achieve. Floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Denver's skyline, modern art carefully selected by professional decorators, furniture that belonged in magazines rather than lived in homes. It was stunning and sterile and suddenly felt like a museum instead of a place where real life happened. Sorry about that, Tim said, finally ending his call and closing the laptop. He crossed to her with that confident stride that had first attracted her, settling beside her on the Italian leather couch and pulling her against his side. Nakamura's lawyers are trying to restructure the intellectual property clauses, but I think we've got them backed into a corner. This deal is going to be— My father is dying, Jacques interrupted, the words falling between them like stones. Tim went absolutely still. What? Pneumonia. The doctors say it's a matter of days. Her voice was calm, eerily controlled, but Tim could see the storm raging behind her dark eyes. I tried calling you, but Elena said you couldn't be disturbed for any reason. Jesus, Jacques, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. Elena should have— Tim pulled out his phone, his fingers flying over the screen. I'll have my jet fueled and ready in an hour. We can be in New Orleans by— You can't. Jacques' voice was quiet but firm. You told me yourself the Nakamura meeting is tomorrow morning. If you miss it, they'll walk away from the deal. Tim's hand stilled on his phone. For a moment, Jacques saw something flicker across his face. A calculation, a weighing of priorities that made her heart sink, even though she'd expected it. They'll understand, he said finally. Family emergencies happen. We can reschedule. Can you? Jacques turned to face him fully. Can you really walk away from the deal that's going to make you a billionaire? Can you disappoint all those investors who are counting on you? Can you risk Nakamura deciding you're not reliable enough to trust with their technology? Tim's jaw tightened. You're more important than any deal. Am I? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with months of cancelled dinners, postponed weekends, and conversations cut short by urgent business calls. Because I've been sitting here for 8 hours, Tim. 8 hours while my father was asking for me, and you couldn't be reached. That's not fair. You know how important this merger is, not just for me, but for the technology, for the jobs it'll create, for your empire, Jacques finished quietly. Always for your empire. The fight that followed was unlike any they'd had before, not the passionate arguments that ended in desperate lovemaking, but something colder and more devastating. Tim tried to justify his priorities, explaining the complexities of international business, the responsibilities he carried to his employees and investors. Jacques listened with growing heartbreak as he laid out perfectly logical reasons why he couldn't simply drop everything and fly to New Orleans. You don't understand, Tim said, running his hands through his hair in frustration. If I blow this deal, it's not just about money. It's about credibility, about every future partnership, about being the youngest billionaire in Colorado, Jacques said. I understand perfectly, Tim. I understand that when push comes to shove, your business will always come first. I understand that no matter what you say about love and partnership, I'll always be secondary to your empire. That's not true, isn't it? Jacques stood up, the pregnancy test still clutched in her hand like a secret weapon she wasn't ready to deploy. My father is dying, Tim. The man who taught me everything about love and music and finding beauty in broken things is dying, and you're worried about disappointing Japanese businessmen. I can fly out tomorrow night, right after the meeting. Tomorrow might be too late. Jacques' voice broke on the words. And even if it isn't, the message is clear. You'll come when it's convenient for your schedule. Tim stood too, reaching for her, but she stepped back. Jacques, please. You're upset, and you have every right to be, but don't make this bigger than it is. One more day. One more day. One more deal. One more emergency that takes priority over us. Jacques felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. When will it be enough, Tim? When will you have enough money, enough success, enough power that you can actually be present for the people who love you? This isn't about money. It's always about money. The words exploded out of her with years of suppressed frustration. Every cancelled dinner, every interrupted conversation, every time you choose your phone over my voice, it's all about money and power and building an empire that means more to you than anything else in your life. Tim's eyes flashed with anger. That empire is what gives us this life, Jacques. This penthouse, the trips, the freedom to support your art programs, none of that exists without the business. I never asked for the penthouse. I never asked for expensive trips. I asked for you, Tim. Just you. Present and engaged, and actually here instead of mentally calculating profit margins while I'm talking. They stared at each other across the beautiful, sterile living room. Two people who had once been so perfectly in sync that they could communicate without words, now separated by a gulf that seemed impossible to bridge. I have to go to New Orleans, Jacques said quietly. With or without you, I have to be there for my father. I know, and I'll come as soon as... No. The word was final, decisive. Don't come when it's convenient. Don't come when your business obligations allow it. Don't come at all. Tim's face went pale. You don't mean that? I do. Jacques walked to the bedroom they'd shared for 8 months, began pulling clothes from drawers with mechanical precision. I mean it completely. Jacques, stop. We can work this out. We always work things out. She paused in her packing, one hand on a sweater that still smelled like his cologne. Do you remember what you told me the night we met? You said you weren't happy, just successful. I thought I could change that. I thought love could be enough to make you choose differently. You did change me. No, I didn't. Jacques turned to face him, and Tim was shaken by the sadness in her eyes. "You're still the same man who puts business before everything else. I'm still just another luxury in your perfectly curated life." "That's not true, and you know it." "Then prove it." Jacques pulled the pregnancy test from her pocket and set it on the dresser between them. "Stay with me. Choose us." Tim stared at the test, his face cycling through shock, wonder, and panic in rapid succession. "You're pregnant. 6 weeks." Jacques watched him carefully, seeing the moment when the implications hit him fully. "I found out this morning, right before I got the call about my father. This changes everything," Tim whispered. "Does it?" Jacques' voice was steady, but her hands shook as she folded another shirt. "Because it seems to me that your meeting is still more important than being here for the mother of your child." Tim moved toward her, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "You're being unfair. This is huge news. We need to talk about this, plan for this." "We do." Jacques closed her suitcase with a decisive snap. "But not tonight. Tonight I need to be with my family, and you need to be in your boardroom. Don't do this, Jacques. Don't walk away from us because of one meeting. This isn't about one meeting, Tim. This is about who you are when it matters most." She moved past him toward the door, pausing only to look back one last time. "I thought I could love you enough to change your priorities. I thought maybe I could be enough to make you choose differently. But I can't compete with your empire, and I won't raise our child to be disappointed by a father who only shows up when it's convenient." "Jacques, wait." But she was already gone, taking with her the scent of her perfume, the warmth of her laughter, and the future they might have built together if love had been enough to tip the scales against ambition. Tim stood alone in his perfect penthouse, surrounded by everything his empire had bought him, and for the first time in his adult life, felt truly poor. Chapter 4. The Hunt for Truth. Obsession, Tim Alstrom discovered, was a relentless master that could drive a rational man to the very edges of sanity in pursuit of answers that might destroy him. For 3 days after Jacques disappeared, Tim closed the Nakamura merger, $1.2 billion that tasted like ash. Elena congratulated him on becoming the youngest billionaire in Colorado, but Tim felt nothing except the echo of Jacques' voice saying she couldn't compete with his empire. On the 4th day, he hired the best private investigative firm in the country. "Find her," he told Marcus Rothstein, a former FBI agent whose discretion was legendary and whose fees were astronomical. "Jacques Canepa. I need to know where she is, what she's doing, if she's—" He couldn't bring himself to say the word "still pregnant," couldn't voice the hope and terror that warred in his chest every time he thought about the life they might have created together. "Of course, Mr. Alstrom. We'll begin immediately." But Tim couldn't wait for professional investigators. That afternoon, he drove to the Meridian Gallery where they'd first met, desperate for any clue about the woman who had vanished as suddenly as she'd entered his life. Her replacement, Derek, practically fell over himself to help when Tim walked in. "Mr. Alstrom, what can I do for you?" "Jacques Canepa. Where did she go?" Derek's enthusiasm deflated. "Family emergency. Her father was ill." He studied Tim with growing interest. "She went back to New Orleans, but called later saying she was staying indefinitely." Tim left with one lead: New Orleans. The investigation consumed him completely. While Rothstein's team worked professionally, Tim became a digital stalker, scouring social media and public records for traces of Jacques' new life. What he found broke his heart and filled him with admiration equally. Jacques had returned to the Tremé neighborhood, working at the New Orleans Community Art Center for barely above poverty wages. But photos showed her surrounded by laughing children, paint-covered and radiant. Then, in a newsletter photo dated 6 months ago, Tim found what he'd been seeking and dreading. Jacques holding a baby with unmistakable green eyes and Tim's stubborn cowlick. Tim stared at the photograph until his eyes burned, using a magnifying glass to study every detail of his son's face. His son. The words felt foreign and wonderful and terrifying simultaneously. Somewhere in New Orleans, he had a child who didn't know his name, a boy who would be walking and talking and discovering the world without his father's guidance or protection. The realization that he'd missed the first year of his son's life hit Tim like a physical blow. First steps, first words, first smiles, all the moments that other fathers treasured, gone forever, because he'd been too proud and too stubborn to follow the woman he loved when she needed him most. "Sir," Elena's voice broke through his reverie, "the car is here for the Hoffman meeting." Tim looked up from his desk where he'd been staring at printouts of every photo he could find of Jacques and Jaime. "Cancel it." "Sir, the Hoffman Group has been trying to get this meeting for months." "Cancel all my meetings for the rest of the week." Tim was already reaching for his phone, calling his pilot. "Have the jet fueled and ready for departure to New Orleans in 2 hours." Elena's professional composure cracked slightly. "Mr. Alstrom, you have the Berkshire Hathaway presentation on Thursday and the board meeting on Friday. Reschedule everything." Tim was pulling files from his desk, his movements sharp with purpose and barely contained emotion. "I don't care if Warren Buffett himself is personally flying in to hear our pitch. Everything gets moved." The flight to New Orleans felt endless despite lasting only 3 hours. Tim sat in his private jet's leather seats, staring out at clouds that looked like cotton candy and trying to prepare for a conversation he'd been rehearsing for months. What did you say to the woman you'd failed so spectacularly? How did you begin to apologize for missing the birth of your child, for choosing a boardroom over being there when she needed you most? New Orleans in late spring was heat and humidity, jazz from street corners, and magnolias mixed with coffee. Tim found the Community Arts Center in a converted warehouse, its brick walls covered in murals celebrating the neighborhood's heritage. Through the windows, he could see children working at easels, their faces serious with concentration as they painted their visions of the world. And there, moving between the young artists with grace and patience, was Jacques. Tim stood across the street for nearly an hour, watching her work. She wore jeans and a paint-splattered t-shirt that had seen better days, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she had never looked more beautiful. The woman he remembered had been elegant and sophisticated, always perfectly put together for gallery openings and charity galas. This version of Jacques was earthier, more grounded, radiating a contentment that made his chest ache with longing. When she stepped outside for a break, sitting on the front steps with a cup of coffee and her face turned toward the afternoon sun, Tim finally found the courage to cross the street. "Hello, Jacques." She looked up, and Tim watched every emotion cycle across her face in the space of a heartbeat. Shock, pain, anger, and something else that might have been relief or might have been regret. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them like a bridge they weren't sure they dared to cross. "You found me," she said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "It took me 4 months." Tim gestured toward the building behind her. "You're doing important work here." "I'm doing necessary work here." Jacques stood, crossing her arms in a gesture that was both defensive and protective. These kids need art in their lives. They need beauty and creativity, and someone who believes they can make something meaningful. "Like you did for me," Tim said quietly. "That was different. You already had everything you needed. You just didn't know how to see it." Her eyes searched his face, looking for changes, for evidence of growth, or just more of the same ambitious stranger who had broken her heart. "What are you doing here, Tim?" "I came to apologize for missing your father's funeral, for choosing a business meeting over being there when you needed me, for failing you so completely that you felt you had to disappear from my life. Tim took a step closer, encouraged when she didn't move away. And I came to meet my son. Jacques' composure cracked slightly at the word son, her breath catching in a way that confirmed what Tim already knew. How long have you known? Since the airport. He has our eyes, the Alstrom eyes, and your mouth, your nose, your beautiful smile. Tim's voice was rough with emotion. His name is Jaime. Yes. The word was barely a whisper. Why didn't you tell me, Jacques? Why didn't you call when he was born, when you were pregnant and scared and dealing with everything alone? Tim wasn't accusatory, just broken. I would have come. Despite everything between us, I would have come. Would you? Jacques' eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. Would you really have dropped everything and flown to New Orleans for a baby you never planned for? Or would Elena have told me you were in important meetings and couldn't be disturbed? The question hit its mark with devastating accuracy. Tim thought about his life over the past 18 months. The deals he'd closed, the meetings he'd attended, the empire he'd continued building while his son took his first steps without him. I don't know, he admitted, the honesty cutting like a knife. I want to say yes, but I don't know if I would have been strong enough to choose differently. And that's exactly why you didn't call, isn't it? I tried, Tim. The day I went into labor, I tried calling you one last time. Elena said you were in Singapore, that you'd specifically requested not to be disturbed for any reason. So I made the decision to protect Jaime from the disappointment of having a father who might or might not show up when he was needed. Tim felt something die inside his chest, the last vestige of righteousness, the final argument he might have made in his own defense. Jesus, Jacques, I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't give me back 18 months of raising our son alone. Sorry doesn't change the nights I walked the floor with a colicky baby, wishing his father cared enough to share the burden. Sorry doesn't. Her voice broke, and Tim saw tears finally spill over onto her cheeks. You're right, Tim said, stepping closer until he could smell her familiar perfume mixed with paint and coffee and something indefinably Jacques. Sorry isn't enough, but it's all I have to start with. Sorry. And the promise that I've changed, that losing you changed me in ways I'm still discovering. People don't change, Tim. Not really. They just get better at hiding who they really are. Then let me prove you wrong. Tim reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. I've restructured my entire business, hired a CEO to handle day-to-day operations, set up a foundation using half my personal wealth to fund arts education programs in underserved communities. I'm still involved, but I'm not running everything personally anymore. Jacques took the envelope with shaking hands, scanning the legal documents that confirmed everything he'd said. Why? Because you were right. Because my empire doesn't mean anything if I don't have anyone to share it with. Because I missed the first 18 months of my son's life, and I'll be damned if I miss another day. Tim's voice was raw with emotion. Because I love you, Jacques. I never stopped loving you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that you and Jaime are more important than any business deal ever could be. It's too late, Tim. Is it? Tim searched her face, looking for hope in the devastation. Because I'm not going anywhere this time. I've rented an apartment 2 blocks from here. I'm not leaving until you give me a chance to know my son. And maybe, if I'm very lucky and work very hard, a chance to earn your trust again. Jacques stared at him for a long moment, and Tim saw the war being fought behind her dark eyes, the practical mother protecting her child against the woman who had once loved him with every fiber of her being. One chance, she said finally. You get one chance to prove you've changed, but if you hurt him, if you disappoint him, if you put your business before his needs even once, I won't, Tim promised, and for the first time in 18 months he felt something that might have been hope. Chapter 5. Proving Worth, Fatherhood, Tim Alstrom learned in the most humbling way possible, could not be bought, negotiated, or acquired through any business skills. It had to be earned one precious moment at a time. The apartment Tim rented was a far cry from his Denver penthouse. Located in a converted Creole cottage on Esplanade Avenue, it featured exposed brick walls, creaking hardwood floors, and windows that let in the sounds of the neighborhood. Children playing in the streets, jazz musicians practicing on their stoops, the distant whistle of streetcars carrying tourists through the quarter. For a man accustomed to climate-controlled perfection and panoramic views of mountain ranges, the change was jarring and oddly liberating. His first official meeting with Jaime took place on neutral territory, Audubon Park, where Jacques had agreed to let Tim spend one supervised hour with their son. Tim arrived 30 minutes early, pacing the pathways like an expectant father, his palms sweating despite the morning breeze off the Mississippi. When Jacques appeared pushing a stroller with a toddler who looked like a miniature version of himself, Tim's heart stopped completely. Jaime was 18 months old now, with chubby cheeks and those unmistakable Alstrom green eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with serious curiosity. He wore a tiny Saints jersey and had chocolate smeared on his chin from what appeared to be a pre-park snack. Jaime, Jacques said softly, kneeling beside the stroller. This is Tim. He's your daddy. Tim felt his knees go weak at the word. Daddy. He was somebody's daddy, this beautiful little boy's father, and he had absolutely no idea how to bridge the gap between the stranger he was and the parent he desperately wanted to become. Hi, buddy, Tim said, his voice rougher than he intended. He knelt down to Jaime's eye level, noting how the boy studied him with that same intense focus Tim recognized from looking in mirrors his entire life. I'm very happy to meet you. Jaime regarded him solemnly for a long moment, then pointed at Tim's face and said clearly, Eyes. That's right, Jacques said, her voice carefully neutral but carrying the faintest hint of emotion. You both have the same eyes. What followed was the most significant hour of Tim's life. Under Jacques' watchful supervision, he pushed Jaime on the swings, marveling at the sound of his son's laughter, pure and joyful and completely uninhibited. They played in the sandbox, where Jaime demonstrated his architectural ambitions by building elaborate sandcastles that he would immediately destroy with gleeful abandon. Tim found himself laughing more in 60 minutes than he had in the previous 18 months. He's incredible, Tim told Jacques as they watched Jaime toddle toward the duck pond with the determined concentration of a tiny explorer. He's so smart, so aware of everything around him. He gets that from you, Jacques admitted reluctantly. Even as a baby, he would study everything like he was solving puzzles in his head. What else? Tim was hungry for details, for stories that would help him understand the little person his son was becoming. What does he like? What makes him laugh? What scares him? Jacques glanced at him, perhaps hearing the genuine need in his voice. He loves music, any kind of music. Jazz, classical, even the pop songs on the radio. He'll dance before he can walk properly. He's fascinated by airplanes and gets excited every time he hears one overhead. And he's terrified of vacuum cleaners but sleeps through thunderstorms. Tim absorbed every word like a man dying of thirst. Does he ask about me? About having a father? He's too young to understand the concept yet, but he notices other children with their daddies at the park, at the grocery store. He's starting to point and ask questions I don't know how to answer. Now you don't have to answer them alone, Tim said quietly. Jacques looked at him for a long moment. Prove it. So Tim began the delicate work of proving himself worthy of the title father. He showed up for every scheduled visit, Never late, never distracted by phone calls or business emergencies. He learned Jaime's schedule: nap time at 1 o'clock, dinner at 5:30, bath time followed by stories and songs that helped him settle down for sleep. He discovered that his son was like him in unexpected ways, particular about how his food was arranged on his plate, happiest when exploring new places, and possessing a stubborn streak that could be overcome with patience and creative negotiation. The breakthrough came 3 weeks into their careful dance of supervised visits. Tim was reading Goodnight Moon for the fifth time that afternoon, Jamie's current obsession, when his son suddenly climbed into his lap and settled against his chest with the complete trust that only children possessed. "Dada," Jaime said, the word muffled against Tim's shirt. Tim's vision blurred with tears he couldn't control. Across the room, he saw Jacques press her hand to her mouth, her own eyes bright with emotion she was trying to hide. "That's right, buddy," Tim whispered into Jaime's soft curls. "I'm your Dada." From that moment forward, the relationship between father and son blossomed with surprising speed. Tim learned to change diapers without gagging, to decode the different cries that meant hungry versus tired versus simply wanting attention. He mastered the art of airplane spoons and discovered that making silly faces could turn a tantrum into giggles in under 30 seconds. But it was the quiet moments that transformed him completely. Holding Jaime while he napped, feeling that small body rise and fall with each breath, Tim understood for the first time in his life what unconditional love actually meant. This wasn't the strategic partnerships or calculated romance that had defined his adult relationships. This was pure, overwhelming, terrifying love that made him want to be better than he'd ever thought possible. "You're good with him," Jacques said one evening as they watched Jaime stack blocks with the methodical precision of a tiny engineer. They were in her apartment now, a modest two-bedroom place that was warm and lived in ways Tim's luxury accommodations had never been. The walls were covered with Jaime's artwork, photos of him at various stages of development, and drawings Jacques had done of their son sleeping, playing, discovering the world around him. "He makes it easy," Tim replied, not taking his eyes off Jaime as the boy carefully balanced one more block on his increasingly precarious tower. "He's such a good kid, Jacques. You've done an amazing job raising him." "We've done an amazing job," she corrected softly, and Tim felt his heart skip at the inclusion. The walls between them were coming down slowly, one shared moment at a time. Tim would arrive with coffee for Jacques, not expensive gourmet blends, but the chicory-laced local brew she preferred. He learned to cook simple meals that Jaime would actually eat, mastering the art of mac and cheese and discovering that his son inherited his own pickiness about vegetables. He baby-proofed his apartment with the thoroughness of a man who'd once negotiated billion-dollar deals, turning the space into a safe haven where Jaime could explore without restriction. The first time Jamie fell asleep in Tim's arms during an afternoon visit, Jacques watched them with an expression that was equal parts heartbreak and hope. "He trusts you," she said when Tim carefully transferred their sleeping son to his crib. "I'm trying to be worthy of that trust," Tim replied. "Every single day I'm trying to be the father he deserves." "What about the father I deserved?" The question slipped out before Jacques could stop it, raw and vulnerable and carrying years of pain. Tim turned to face her fully, seeing the woman who had loved him enough to dream of a future together, who had been brave enough to walk away when that future became impossible. "I failed you," he said simply. "I failed you completely, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make up for that. But I can't change the past, Jacques. I can only try to build a better future." "How do I know you won't choose your empire again when things get difficult? How do I know you won't decide that being a weekend father is enough? That the daily reality of parenting is too much work for someone like you?" Tim reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The device that had once been his lifeline to the business world, that had interrupted countless conversations and stolen attention from the people who mattered most. He set it on the kitchen counter and deliberately turned it off. "I haven't checked my email in 4 hours," he said. 4 hours, Jacques. For me, that used to be unthinkable. But Jaime was learning to play peekaboo, and you were laughing at his concentration face, and nothing else in the world seemed important enough to interrupt that moment. Jacques stared at the silent phone. "Your business will survive without my constant oversight. That's why I hired competent people to run things when I'm not available. And for the first time in my adult life, I'm deliberately making myself unavailable for something more important than profit margins." "For how long?" Her voice was quiet, but Tim heard the fear beneath the question. "How long before you get bored with playing house? How long before you remember how much you love the excitement of closing deals and making billions?" Tim moved closer, close enough to smell her familiar perfume, mixed with baby powder and the lingering scent of the finger paints she'd been using with her art students that morning. "I used to think success meant having more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. Now I think success means being the man my son can be proud of, the partner you can trust completely. The rest is just numbers on spreadsheets." "Words are easy, Tim. You're right. So judge me by my actions." Tim gestured toward the child's artwork covering her refrigerator, some of which featured stick figures that Jaime had identified as Dada. "I've been here every day for 6 weeks. I've canceled 3 board meetings to be at Jaime's pediatrician appointments. I fired my assistant because she kept trying to convince me that conference calls were more important than bedtime stories." Jacques' eyes widened. "You fired Elena?" She couldn't accept that my priorities had changed. When she scheduled a brief call during Jaime's nap time without asking me first, I realized she was still operating under the old rules. Tim smiled ruefully. "Turns out I'm perfectly capable of managing my own calendar when I actually want to be present for my life." They stood in comfortable silence, watching Jaime sleep through the baby monitor, both lost in thoughts about the past and the tentative hope of a different future. When Jacques' hand accidentally brushed against Tim's while reaching for her coffee cup, neither of them pulled away immediately. The contact was electric, charged with memories and possibilities, and the kind of chemistry that had drawn them together in the first place. "I'm scared," Jacques admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of what?" "Of hoping again. Of believing that this time might be different. Of letting myself fall for you again, only to discover that underneath all these changes, you're still the same man who chose a boardroom over being there when I needed you most." Tim turned his hand palm up, offering without demanding, letting her choose whether to accept the gesture. When she slowly laced her fingers through his, he felt like he'd just closed the most important deal of his life. "I'm scared too," he confessed. "I'm terrified that I'll mess this up, that I don't know how to be the father Jaime needs, or the partner you deserve. But I'm more terrified of living without you both. So I'm willing to be scared if it means I get a chance to prove that love can change a man completely." Outside, the sounds of New Orleans continued their eternal rhythm. Jazz from street corners, laughter from neighboring apartments, the distant rumble of ships on the Mississippi. Inside Jacques' small apartment, 2 people who had loved and lost and found each other again sat holding hands and watching their son sleep, both afraid to hope but too much in love not to try. Chapter 6. Hearts remembering some storms arrive with warning sirens and weather alerts. But the thunderstorm that changed everything between Tim and Jacques came disguised as an ordinary Tuesday evening, quiet and unremarkable until lightning split the sky and revealed truths they had both been hiding. 2 months into Tim's new life in New Orleans, their relationship had settled into a careful routine. He would arrive at Jacques' apartment each morning to spend time with Jaime before her work at the art center, then return in the evenings for dinner and bedtime stories. They were co-parenting with careful efficiency, former lovers who had learned to navigate around the wreckage of their past, cautious not to stand too close, careful not to let their hands linger when passing Jaime between them, careful not to acknowledge the electricity that sparked every time their eyes met across their son's head. It was working. It was civilized and mature and completely unsustainable. The storm had been building all day, thick, oppressive heat that made the air feel solid, the kind of weather that sent smart people indoors with cold drinks and ceiling fans. Tim had been reading The Very Hungry Caterpillar to Jaime for the third time when the first rumble of thunder made their son look up with wide, curious eyes. Big noise, Jaime observed with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child who had grown up with Gulf Coast weather. That's thunder, buddy, Tim explained, pulling Jaime closer on his lap. It's just the sky making music. Like Mama's jazz records? Jaime asked, and Tim felt his heart clench at being included in Jaime's small universe of familiar things. Exactly like Mama's jazz records, Tim confirmed, glancing over at Jacques, who was grading art projects at the kitchen table. She looked up at the sound of her name, and their eyes met with the kind of awareness that made Tim's pulse quicken, despite all his careful resolutions. The power went out 20 minutes later, plunging the apartment into the kind of darkness that only comes with complete electrical failure. Jaime, who had been drowsing against Tim's chest, startled awake with a confused whimper. "It's okay, baby," Jacques' voice came from the kitchen, calm and soothing. "Mama's going to find the flashlights." But when she stood up, Tim heard her sharp intake of breath, followed by a string of soft curses that would have made a sailor proud. "What's wrong?" Tim was on his feet immediately, Jaime secure in his arms. "I knocked over my coffee cup when the lights went out. It's all over my papers, 2 weeks' worth of progress reports for the kids." He could hear the frustration in her voice, the exhaustion of a single mother who worked too hard and had too little margin for small disasters. Tim moved carefully through the darkened apartment, using the faint light from his phone to navigate. He found Jacques in the kitchen, standing in a puddle of coffee and ruined paperwork, looking like she was about to cry. "Hey," he said softly, shifting Jaime to one arm and reaching out to touch her shoulder with his free hand. "It's just paper. You can redo it." "It's not just paper," Jacques said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "It's hours of work, observations about each child's progress, notes for parent conferences that are scheduled for tomorrow. It's—" She gestured helplessly at the mess. "It's everything I do here not being enough." Tim recognized the overwhelm in her voice, the particular brand of exhaustion that came from carrying too much responsibility alone. He'd felt it himself during the worst periods of building his empire, but he'd had armies of assistants and unlimited resources to help shoulder the load. Jacques had been doing everything by herself for nearly 2 years. "Okay," he said decisively. "Jaime and I are going to clean this up while you take a hot shower. Then we're going to sit down with my laptop and recreate every single report from scratch. I type 90 words per minute, and my memory for details is pretty good when I'm actually paying attention. Tim, you don't have to—" "I want to." The words came out with more intensity than he'd intended, revealing depths of feeling he'd been trying to keep contained. "Let me help you, Jacques. Let me be useful for something other than writing checks." The shower upstairs was running when the next wave of storms arrived, with biblical fury. Rain hammered against the windows like bullets, and thunder shook the small apartment with enough force to rattle dishes in the cupboards. Jaime, who had been remarkably calm during the power outage, began to fuss as the storm intensified. Tim found himself pacing the living room, trying to soothe their son with the same techniques he'd watched Jacques use, gentle bouncing, soft singing, the kind of patient comfort that couldn't be rushed or negotiated. But Jaime's fussing escalated to genuine crying, the heartbreaking wails of a tired toddler who had been disrupted from his normal routine. "Shh, buddy, it's okay," Tim murmured, feeling increasingly helpless as nothing he tried seemed to work. "Daddy's here. Everything's fine." "Mama," Jaime sobbed, reaching toward the stairs where the sound of running water provided the only proof that Jacques hadn't vanished completely. "Want Mama?" Tim felt a familiar stab of inadequacy, the same feeling that had plagued him during his early attempts at fatherhood, the sense that he would always be the substitute parent, the one Jaime tolerated when his real source of comfort wasn't available. But tonight, with rain pounding the windows and his son crying in his arms, Tim made a decision that would have been unthinkable 18 months ago. He sat down on Jacques' worn couch, settled Jaime against his chest, and began to sing. It wasn't a lullaby. Tim didn't know any lullabies. It was Summertime from Porgy and Bess, a song he'd heard Jacques humming while she cooked dinner, a piece of music that belonged to this city and this moment, and the woman upstairs who had taught him that jazz could heal broken hearts. His voice was rough, unpracticed, nothing like the smooth crooning of professional singers, but it was real and present and filled with love for the child in his arms. Gradually, Jaime's sobs subsided to hiccups, then to the heavy breathing of exhaustion. By the time Tim reached the second verse, their son was asleep against his shoulder, small fingers tangled in his shirt, completely trusting and peaceful. "You have a beautiful voice." Tim looked up to find Jacques standing at the bottom of the stairs, her hair damp from the shower, wearing an oversized Saints t-shirt that reached mid-thigh and nothing else that he could see. In the flickering light of the emergency candles she'd lit, she looked like something from a dream. All golden skin and soft curves, and eyes that held secrets he wanted to spend a lifetime discovering. "I was making it up as I went along," Tim admitted, his voice husky from singing and from the way she was looking at him. "That's the best way to do jazz," Jacques said, moving closer but maintaining the careful distance they'd established. "Improvisation, finding the music in the moment." She reached out to stroke Jaime's back, and her fingers brushed against Tim's arm in the process. The contact was electric, sending heat racing through his bloodstream like he was 19 instead of 32. When she didn't immediately pull away, Tim felt his breath catch. "He really loves you," Jacques whispered, her voice soft with wonder and something that might have been longing. "Sometimes I watch you two together, and I can't believe how natural you are with him, like you were always meant to be his father." "I wish I had been," Tim said quietly. "I wish I'd been here from the beginning, that I'd held him as a baby, that I'd been the one walking the floor with him during those long nights you described." "Tim, I know I can't change the past, but looking at him now, seeing how perfect he is, how smart and funny and brave." Tim's voice broke slightly. "I can't imagine my life without him. I can't imagine my life without both of you." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they dared to cross. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the city, but inside the small apartment, the only sound was the gentle whisper of Jaime's breathing and the thundering of two hearts that had never really learned how to beat apart. "We should put him to bed," Jacques said finally, but she made no move to step away from Tim's chair. "In a minute," Tim replied, because moving would mean breaking this spell, and he wasn't ready to return to their careful politeness just yet. They stayed like that for nearly an hour, Tim holding their sleeping son while Jacques sat on the coffee table facing them, her knees almost touching his, her presence warm and comforting in the candlelit darkness. They talked in whispers about everything and nothing, Jaime's latest words, funny things that had happened at the Arts Center, books they'd both read, dreams they'd once shared and might dare to share again. "Do you remember," Jacques said as the storm finally began to subside, That night we got caught in the rain, walking back from dinner at Commander's Palace. You insisted we could make it to your car without getting soaked, and we ended up completely drenched before we'd gone half a block. Tim smiled at the memory. You were wearing that white dress that turned completely transparent when it got wet. I thought I was going to have to fight off every man in the quarter. You gave me your jacket even though it meant you'd be walking around in a soaked shirt for the rest of the evening. Best worst decision I ever made, Tim said, remembering how they'd ended up back at his penthouse, stripping off wet clothes and making love with the desperate intensity of people who knew they were running out of time. We made love that night like the world was ending. Tim. His name was a warning, a plea, a prayer, all rolled into one. I know, he said quickly. I know we can't go back. I know too much has happened, too much trust has been broken. But God, Jacques, sitting here with you and Jaime, it feels like coming home for the first time in my life. She reached out then, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw with the kind of reverent touch that spoke of muscle memory and hearts that refused to forget. You broke my heart, she whispered. I know. You made me choose between loving you and protecting myself. I know. I can't do that again, Tim. I can't let myself fall for you again only to discover that when push comes to shove, your empire will always come first. It won't, Tim said with quiet certainty. I swear to you, Jacques, it won't. You and Jaime are my empire now. Everything else is just business. The kiss that followed was inevitable, gentle and desperate, and filled with 2 years of longing and regret. Jacques' lips were soft and warm, and tasted like the promises they'd once made to each other in the darkness of his mountain cabin. When she finally pulled away, they were both breathing hard, both fighting against the gravitational pull that had always existed between them. This is dangerous, she whispered, her forehead resting against his. I know. We're good co-parents. We work well together now. If we complicate this... We're already complicated, Tim interrupted gently. We've been complicated since the moment we met. The question is whether we're brave enough to try again, or whether we're going to spend the rest of our lives pretending we don't still love each other. Jacques' breath caught at his words, and Tim saw the war being fought behind her dark eyes. The woman who had once loved him enough to plan a future together, battling with the mother who had learned to protect herself and her child from disappointment. I need time, she said finally. You have all the time you need, Tim promised. I'm not going anywhere, Jacques. Whatever you decide, however long it takes, I'm going to be right here, loving you and raising our son, and proving every single day that you can trust me with your heart again. Thunder rumbled in the distance as the storm moved on toward Lake Pontchartrain, leaving behind the clean scent of rain and the electric charge of possibility. In the morning, the power would be restored, and they would return to their careful routine of shared parenting and polite boundaries. But tonight, in the candlelit darkness with their son sleeping peacefully in Tim's arms, they both knew that something fundamental had shifted between them. The walls were coming down, one careful brick at a time, and neither of them was strong enough to stop the demolition anymore. Chapter 7. The Other Man. Heartbreak has perfect timing, and it arrived at Tim Alstrom's door on a Saturday morning, disguised as a pediatrician with kind eyes, steady hands, and a diamond ring intended for the woman Tim was falling in love with all over again. Tim had been looking forward to this weekend more than any business deal he'd ever closed. 3 months of careful relationship building with Jacques had led to an invitation that felt like a victory. An entire Saturday with both her and Jaime, starting with farmers market shopping and ending with a family dinner at her apartment. For the first time since returning to New Orleans, Tim felt like he might actually be winning the war for his family's heart. He arrived at Jacques' apartment that morning with coffee from her favorite cafe and beignets still warm from Café du Monde, ready to spend a perfect day being the man she and Jaime deserved. What he found instead was his worst nightmare standing in her kitchen, making pancakes like he belonged there. Dr. Antoine Broussard was everything Tim wasn't, tall where Tim was average height, dark-skinned where Tim was pale, radiating calm competence that came from saving lives instead of acquiring companies. He wore scrubs like other men wore designer suits, moved through Jock's kitchen with practiced familiarity, and looked up when Tim entered with a smile that was genuinely warm and completely devastating. "You must be Tim," Antoine said, extending a hand that probably performed miracles in operating rooms. "I'm Antoine. I've heard so much about you." Tim shook the offered hand, noting the strength in Antoine's grip, the calluses that spoke of hands-on work, the complete absence of any jewelry except for a simple watch that probably cost less than Tim spent on coffee in a month. Everything about this man screamed good person, which somehow made everything infinitely worse. "Where's Jock?" Tim managed, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. "Mama's in the shower," Jaime announced from his high chair, where he was demolishing a plate of pancakes with the focused intensity he brought to all important tasks. "Papa made pancakes. Papa." The word struck Tim like a physical blow, stealing breath from his lungs and narrowing his vision to a tunnel. Papa, his son, was calling another man Papa while Tim stood there holding coffee and pastries like some weekend uncle. "Jaime loves pancakes," Antoine explained, apparently oblivious to the way Tim's world had just cracked down the middle. "Saturday mornings are our tradition when I'm not on call at the hospital." Our tradition. Tim felt something die inside his chest, something that had been growing and healing over the past 3 months. He'd been so careful, so patient, so determined to prove that he'd changed, and all the while another man had been building a life with his family. "How long have you been?" Tim couldn't finish the question, couldn't bring himself to ask how long this stranger had been playing father to his son. "Almost 2 years now," Antoine said, flipping pancakes with the casual ease of a man completely comfortable in domestic spaces. "Jacques and I met at the hospital when Jaime had that scary fever spike as a baby. I was the attending pediatrician, and she was this terrified single mother who hadn't slept in 3 days. I knew right away she was special. 2 years. While Tim had been building his empire and congratulating himself on becoming the youngest billionaire in Colorado, Antoine had been there, holding Jaime when he was sick, comforting Jacques through the sleepless nights of single parenthood, becoming the father figure Tim should have been from the beginning. "Dada!" Jaime suddenly noticed Tim's presence, reaching out with pancake-sticky hands and that brilliant smile that could light up the darkest corners of Tim's heart. "You came?" "Of course I came, buddy," Tim said, moving to ruffle Jaime's hair and trying to ignore the way his son had seamlessly switched from calling Antoine Papa to calling him Dada without any apparent confusion. At 18 months old, Jaime didn't understand the complexities of adult relationships. He simply loved the people who showed up for him consistently. "Tim," Jacques' voice carried from the hallway, bright with what sounded like genuine pleasure. "You're early. I thought we were meeting at 10. She appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing a sundress the color of spring leaves, her hair still damp from the shower, looking radiant and beautiful and completely unaware that Tim's carefully constructed hope was crumbling around him. When she saw Antoine at the stove, her expression shifted to something Tim couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe, or guilt, or the complicated emotion of a woman caught between two men who both had legitimate claims on her attention. "Antoine, I thought you were working this weekend," she said, accepting the kiss he pressed to her temple with the casual intimacy of long habit. "Surgery got cancelled," Antoine replied, sliding an arm around her waist with the kind of possessive affection that made Tim want to hit something. Thought I'd surprise you and Jaime with breakfast before I have to head in for rounds. That's wonderful, Jacques said, but Tim caught the quick glance she threw in his direction, the flash of something that might have been apology or regret. The morning that followed was torture disguised as family bonding. Tim watched as Antoine helped Jaime with his pancakes, listened to their easy banter about weekend plans and shared jokes, observed the way Jacques smiled at the doctor with genuine affection and gratitude. This wasn't some casual relationship or convenient arrangement. This was a family, complete and functional and happy without Tim's presence. At the farmer's market, Tim trailed behind the group like a fifth wheel, carrying bags and watching as Jaime rode on Antoine's shoulders, pointing at vendor stalls and chattering about everything he saw. Other shoppers probably assumed they were looking at a perfect family. The handsome doctor, the beautiful artist, and the adorable toddler who called them both Papa and Dada with equal enthusiasm. "You're quiet today," Jacques commented when they stopped at a produce stand, her voice low enough that Antoine, who was helping Jaime pick out apples, couldn't hear. "Just processing," Tim replied, which was the understatement of the century. "I know this is awkward. I should have told you Antoine was coming by." "Should you have told me you were in a relationship?" Tim interrupted, his voice sharper than he intended. "Should you have mentioned that my son calls another man Papa? Because those seem like fairly significant details to leave out of our co-parenting conversations." Jacques' cheeks flushed. "It's complicated, Tim." "Is it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks pretty straightforward. You've moved on. You've built a life with someone else. Someone who was there when I wasn't. Someone who earned the right to be called Papa while I was off playing corporate mogul." "That's not—" Jacques started, then stopped, glancing over at Antoine and Jaime. "This isn't the place for this conversation." "When is the place for this conversation?" "When you're married to him. When he adopts Jaime and I become the biological father who sends birthday cards twice a year." The words hung between them like a challenge, and Tim saw the moment when Jacques made a decision that would change everything. "Tim, there's something I need to tell you," she said quietly. "Antoine proposed last week." The farmer's market continued buzzing around them, vendors calling out prices, children laughing, the general chaos of Saturday morning commerce. But for Tim, everything went silent except for the sound of his own heart breaking. "And," he managed, "I said I needed time to think about it." Tim wanted to feel relief that she hadn't said yes immediately, but all he could focus on was the fact that she hadn't said no either. "What's to think about? He's clearly good with Jaime. He makes you happy. He's been here when I wasn't. He's everything I failed to be." "Tim?" "No, it's fine," Tim said, and was surprised to find that his voice was steady, despite the earthquake happening inside his chest. "I get it. I really do. You can't trust me not to disappoint you again, so you found someone reliable. Someone who shows up when he promises to. Someone who puts family first." Jacques' eyes filled with tears. "It's not that simple, isn't it?" Tim looked over at Antoine, who was now lifting Jaime so he could reach a bunch of bananas, both of them laughing at something the vendor had said. "He's a good man, Jacques. Anyone can see that. And he loves you, both of you. Maybe you should marry him. Is that what you want?" The question came out in a whisper, and Tim realized that this was his moment, the test he'd been preparing for without knowing it. He could fight for her, could make grand gestures and promises about how he'd changed, could compete with Antoine's steady reliability with his own passionate intensity. Or he could do what he'd never done before in his entire life, put Jacques' happiness ahead of his own desires. "I want you to be happy," Tim said, and meant it despite the way the words felt like swallowing broken glass. "I want Jaime to have a father who'll never let him down, who'll be there for every baseball game and science project and heartbreak. If that's Antoine, then that's what I want for both of you. And what about what you want? Tim looked at his son, giggling in Antoine's arms, completely secure and loved and protected. Then he looked at Jacques, beautiful and torn and deserving of a love that would never make her choose between security and passion. What I want doesn't matter anymore, Tim said quietly. What matters is that you and Jaime have the life you deserve. If I can give you that by stepping back, then that's what I'll do. He started to turn away, but Jacques caught his arm. Tim, wait. I should go, he said, because staying was only going to make this harder for all of them. You have a decision to make, and my being here isn't going to make it any easier. Will you still— Jacques' voice broke slightly. Will you still want to see Jaime? Even if I marry Antoine? The question nearly undid him completely. The thought of becoming a weekend father, of watching his son grow up from the sidelines while another man got to be there for all the important moments, was almost unbearable. But the alternative, walking away completely, was impossible. If you'll let me, Tim said, I'll take whatever relationship with him you're comfortable with, weekends, holidays, whatever works for your family. Your family, not our family, not his family, her family with Antoine. Tim walked away from the farmer's market feeling like he was leaving pieces of his heart scattered among the vegetable stalls and flower vendors. Behind him, he could hear Jaime calling Dada. In confusion, could hear Jacques' voice explaining that Daddy had to go do some work, could hear Antoine's gentle tone as he distracted the boy with promises of ice cream. For 3 months, Tim had allowed himself to believe that love could conquer his past mistakes, that patience and presence could rebuild what ambition had destroyed. Now he understood that some damage was irreversible, some trust could never be fully restored, and some love stories didn't get happy endings no matter how desperately the characters wanted them. He had given Jacques the space to choose the life she wanted, and she was choosing the safer option. The better option. The option that wouldn't break her heart again when business called and family came second. Tim couldn't blame her for that choice, even as it destroyed him completely. Chapter 8. Dark Night of the Soul. Rock bottom, Tim Alstrom discovered, wasn't a place you fell to. It was a place you constructed for yourself. One self-destructive choice at a time, until you looked around and realized you were living in a prison of your own making. The penthouse felt like a mausoleum when Tim returned, after watching Jacques choose her safe, stable future with Antoine. The panoramic views that had once filled him with pride now mocked him with their emptiness. For the first week, Tim threw himself into work with manic intensity. Emergency board meetings, microscopic contract analysis, personally reviewing every proposal. His assistants scrambled to keep up with his suddenly insatiable appetite for corporate busy work. But the numbers couldn't fill the Jaime-shaped void in his chest, and no amount of planning could silence the echo of his son's voice, calling Dada with pure joy. By the second week, Tim had stopped maintaining basic hygiene. By the third, he was having scotch for breakfast and conducting video conferences in wrinkled shirts he had slept in. His reflection showed a hollow-eyed stranger who had lost everything rather than one of the country's most successful entrepreneurs. Sir, his newest assistant, a efficient young woman named Rebecca, knocked hesitantly on his office door. The Kellerman Group is here for your 2 o'clock meeting. Tim looked up from the architectural plans he'd been staring at without seeing for the past hour. Cancel it. Sir, this meeting has been scheduled for 6 weeks. Mr. Kellerman flew in from Seattle specifically. Cancel it, Tim repeated, his voice flat and lifeless. Cancel everything for the rest of the week. Cancel everything until further notice. Rebecca hesitated in the doorway, clearly wanting to point out that canceling everything wasn't actually an option for the CEO of a billion-dollar company, but something in Tim's expression made her simply nod and retreat. Tim walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that had once made him feel like king of the world and stared down at the ant-like people moving through downtown Denver. Somewhere in New Orleans, Jacques was probably teaching children to find beauty in broken things, while Antoine made her laugh over dinner. Somewhere in that same city, Jaime was learning new words and taking tentative steps toward a future that wouldn't include his biological father as anything more than a peripheral figure. The phone calls from New Orleans had stopped after the first week. Tim had answered the first few, brief, awkward conversations where Jacques updated him on Jaime's milestones and asked about his schedule for potential visits. Tim had been polite but distant, not wanting to make her decision any harder than it already was. Eventually, she'd stopped calling, and Tim had been too proud and too broken to call back. The drinking started as a way to sleep through the nights that stretched endlessly without the sounds of Jaime's breathing from the next room. One glass of scotch became two, then four, then losing count entirely. Tim would wake up on his couch at 3 in the morning, still dressed in yesterday's clothes, with empty bottles scattered around like evidence of a life coming apart at the seams. His business partners expressed concern. Board meetings were postponed when Tim showed up intoxicated. The company's stock fluctuated as investors worried about leadership stability. "This has to stop," his CFO, David Martinez, said during one disastrous Monday meeting. "You're running this company into the ground." "So fire me," Tim replied, adding bourbon to his coffee. "You're the majority shareholder. We can't fire you, but we're sending you to therapy. Professional help, Tim, because whatever happened in New Orleans broke something none of us can fix." Meanwhile, 1,500 miles away, Jacques discovered that choosing safety didn't guarantee happiness. Antoine was everything a woman could want: kind, reliable, devoted to both her and Jaime. When he proposed the second time at Commander's Palace, Jacques said yes because it was the logical choice, the mature choice guaranteeing Jaime a stable father figure. But logic made for cold comfort during sleepless nights, when she missed a man who had broken her heart so completely she'd fled across the country. The engagement ring felt heavy on her finger, beautiful but wrong somehow, like a costume jewelry piece that didn't quite fit the role she was trying to play. Antoine talked excitedly about wedding plans, about honeymoon destinations, about the house they would buy in the suburbs where Jaime could have a proper yard and they could add to their family. Everything he described sounded perfect and felt empty. "You're not happy," her best friend Celeste observed one afternoon as they watched Jaime play at the neighborhood park. "You just got engaged to a man who worships the ground you walk on, and you look like someone died." "I'm fine," Jacques insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. "Honey, you've been fine for 2 months now. When's the last time you were actually happy?" The answer came immediately to Jacques' mind. The night of the thunderstorm, sitting in candlelight while Tim held their sleeping son and sang jazz standards in his rough, untrained voice. She'd been happy then, terrified and hopeful and completely alive in a way she hadn't felt since leaving Denver 3 years ago. "I made the right choice," Jacques said, more to herself than to Celeste. "Antoine is good for us. He's reliable and kind, and he loves Jaime." "But do you love him?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Jacques loved Antoine. Of course she did. He'd been there during the hardest period of her life, had helped her navigate single motherhood with patience and grace, had never once made her feel like a burden or an obligation. She loved him the way you love a dear friend, with gratitude and affection and genuine care for his well-being. But she wasn't in love with him. She didn't wake up thinking about his smile or fall asleep replaying conversations in her head. Her pulse didn't quicken when he walked into a room, and her skin didn't burn where he touched her. She felt safe with Antoine, cherished and protected and valued. With Tim, she had felt alive. The discovery came 2 weeks later while cleaning her bedroom closet. A shoebox fell from the top shelf, spilling letters addressed to her and Jamie in Tim's handwriting, letters that had arrived weekly but gone unopened since her engagement to Antoine. With shaking hands, Jacques opened the first one, dated the week after Tim had returned to Denver. My darling Jacques and beautiful Jamie. I'm writing this letter that I'll probably never send, but I need to put these words somewhere outside my own head before they drive me completely insane. I know you've made your choice, and I respect it completely. Antoine is everything I should have been and wasn't. Present, reliable, someone you can count on to show up when he promises to. Jaime is lucky to have him as a father figure. But I need you to know that every day I don't spend with you both feels like dying a little. I wake up reaching for my phone to text you about something funny I thought of. Then remember that I don't have the right to be part of your daily life anymore. I pass fathers playing with their children in the park and feel like someone's carved out my chest with a rusty spoon. I know I have no right to miss you the way I do. I know I forfeited the privilege of loving you when I chose my empire over being there when you needed me most. But I need you to know that losing you, losing both of you, has taught me more about what really matters than all my success ever could. I hope you're happy, my love. I hope Antoine makes you laugh the way you deserve to laugh. And I hope Jaime grows up surrounded by the kind of love that will make him strong and kind and brave. I hope you both forget me quickly and completely, because missing you is the most beautiful agony I've ever experienced, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. All my love, always. Tim. Jacques read through tears that came in waves, each letter revealing more of Tim's pain and growth and desperate love for them both. He wrote about the therapy he'd started, about the ways he was restructuring his business to prioritize the things that actually mattered. He wrote about missing Jaime's bedtime stories and wondering if their son remembered the songs they used to share. He wrote about loving her from a distance and wanting nothing more than her happiness, even if it didn't include him. The final letter, dated just a week ago, was different from the others. My beautiful family. I'm writing to tell you goodbye. Not forever. I hope I'll always be allowed to love you both from whatever distance you're comfortable with. But goodbye to the dream that we might find our way back to each other. I've learned to accept that some mistakes can't be undone, some trust can't be rebuilt, and some love stories don't get the endings we want. You deserve better than a man who took 3 years to learn how to put family first, and Jamie deserves a father who was there from the beginning. I'm getting better, slowly. The therapy is helping, and I've made changes to my business that would probably shock you. I'm learning to live with the hole you've left in my life, learning to be grateful for the time I had with you instead of bitter about the time I lost. Be happy, my darling girl. Love Antoine the way he deserves to be loved, and let him love you both the way I never learned how to do properly. Raise our son to be better than his father was, and maybe, someday, tell him that I loved him more than life itself, even if I didn't know how to show it when it mattered most. Forever yours, Tim. P.S. I've set up a trust fund for Jaime's education and future. The paperwork will arrive this week. It's not about money, it's about making sure he has every opportunity to become the incredible man I know he'll be, even if I'm not there to help him get there. Jacques sobbed until she had no tears left, surrounded by evidence of a love so deep and selfless that it took her breath away. Tim wasn't fighting for her anymore. He was letting her go because he thought it was what she needed. He was choosing her happiness over his own, just as she had always dreamed he might learn to do. The question was, what did she actually want her happiness to look like? Chapter 9. The choice, courage, Jacques Canepa realized as she stood outside Tim's Denver building, with Jaime sleeping in her arms, sometimes looked like the most reckless thing imaginable, and sometimes it was the only thing that could save you from a lifetime of wondering, what if? The flight from New Orleans had been 3 hours of second-guessing herself. With every mile, Jacques questioned the impulse that had driven her to pack a suitcase and board a plane with their son, without telling anyone where she was going. Antoine thought she was visiting her aunt in Baton Rouge. Her friends would think she'd lost her mind. Maybe she had. But Tim's letters, 37 of them, read until memorized, had shattered every justification she'd built for her engagement to Antoine. The man who had written those letters wasn't the ambitious stranger who had broken her heart. This was someone broken himself and rebuilt into something deeper, more real, more worthy of the love she'd never stopped feeling. The problem was that letters could lie. Words on paper didn't have to face daily reality, choosing family over profit, being present when inconvenient, proving that change was permanent rather than temporary. Jacques needed to see with her own eyes whether Tim's transformation was real or just another beautiful promise. The lobby of Tim's building was as impressive as she remembered, all marble and brass and the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted wealth. But the concierge who greeted her seemed surprised when she asked for Tim's penthouse. "I'm sorry, miss, but Mr. Wallstrom moved out several months ago," the uniformed man said politely. "He sold the penthouse to a tech executive from California. Very nice gentleman." Jacques felt her heart sink. "Do you know where he moved to?" "I believe he has a smaller place in the Highlands neighborhood now, much more modest, but he seemed quite happy with the change." The address led Jacques to a tree-lined street filled with craftsman bungalows, the kind of neighborhood where families lived rather than invested. Tim's house was a charming two-story with a wraparound porch and wildflowers beginning to bloom. Jacques stood on the sidewalk, adjusting Jaime's weight, trying to process the disconnect between the Tim she remembered and the man who would choose quiet domesticity over penthouse luxury. She was still debating whether to ring the doorbell when the front door opened and Tim emerged, wearing faded jeans and a worn t-shirt, carrying art supplies toward his car. 3 months had changed him. He was leaner, his hair longer and slightly unkempt, with new lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and hard-won wisdom. But it was his posture that struck her most. The aggressive confidence had been replaced by something quieter, more grounded. When he saw her standing on his sidewalk, Tim went completely still. The box of art supplies slipped from his hands, clattering to the driveway and spilling brushes and paint tubes across the concrete. "Jacques." Her name came out like a prayer, like he wasn't sure she was real. "Hello, Tim," she said softly, watching his face cycle through shock, hope, and something that might have been fear. "Is everything okay? Is Jaime—" His eyes went immediately to their son, checking for signs of illness or injury with the instinctive concern of a parent. "He's fine. We're both fine. I just—" Jacques struggled to find words that would explain her presence without revealing how desperately she needed to know if what she'd read in his letters was true. "I wanted to see you. We were visiting Denver, and I thought maybe we could talk." Tim nodded slowly, still looking like he expected her to vanish if he moved too quickly. "Of course. Yes. Come in, please. I'll make coffee unless you prefer tea. I have both now. And juice boxes for Jaime in case he wakes up and wants—" He was babbling, nervous in a way she'd never seen him before. "Coffee's fine," Jacques said gently, following him up the porch steps and into his new life. The house's interior was nothing like his old penthouse, where that space had been all clean lines and expensive art chosen by decorators. This felt like a home where people actually lived. The furniture was comfortable rather than impressive, books scattered on end tables, and the refrigerator covered with children's artwork. "You have other kids visiting?" Jacques asked, studying a crayon drawing of what might have been a dinosaur, or possibly a very misshapen dog. Tim's cheeks flushed slightly. I volunteer at the Children's Hospital on weekends. Art therapy sessions for kids who are stuck there long term. He gestured toward the refrigerator with pride usually reserved for museum exhibitions. This one's by Maria. She's 7 and has leukemia, but draws incredible fantasy worlds. Jacques stared at him, trying to reconcile this information with the man she'd known. Since when do you volunteer at children's hospitals? Since I realized that having money doesn't mean anything if you're not using it to help people who actually need it. Tim busied himself making coffee, his movements efficient but slightly shaky. I started the foundation 6 months ago, programs for single mothers, art therapy for hospitalized children, scholarships for kids who want to pursue creative careers but can't afford the education. Tim, Jacques was struggling to process this transformation. What happened to your business, your empire? I hired a CEO to run daily operations. I'm still involved in major decisions, but I'm not working 18-hour days anymore. Tim turned to face her, leaning against the counter with an expression that was vulnerable and honest in ways the old Tim never would have allowed. I discovered that building an empire is meaningless if you don't have anyone to share it with. Jaime stirred in Jacques' arms, blinking sleepy eyes and looking around the unfamiliar space with the alert curiosity of a toddler who'd just awakened somewhere new. "Hey, buddy," Tim said softly, moving closer but not presuming to take Jaime without permission. "You're in Denver. Do you remember me?" Jaime studied Tim's face for a moment, then smiled with the pure joy that only small children could produce. "Dada. You have new house." "I do have a new house," Tim confirmed, accepting Jaime when the boy reached for him. "Would you like to see your room?" "My room?" Jacques felt her breath catch. "Tim, you don't need to." "I wanted him to have a space here," Tim said quietly. "Even if he only visits occasionally. Even if you decide, well, even if things don't work out the way I hope they will." He carried Jamie down a hallway lined with framed photos, pictures of their son at various stages of development that Tim must have gotten from Jacques' social media posts, mixed with candid shots of Jaime during their time together in New Orleans. At the end of the hall, Tim opened a door to reveal a perfect little boy's room. But it wasn't the typical over-the-top display of wealth Jacques might have expected. Instead, the room was thoughtfully designed for a growing child. A convertible toddler bed, shelves with age-appropriate books and toys, art supplies in colorful containers, and a reading corner with soft cushions. Everything spoke of a father who had thought carefully about what his son would actually need, rather than what money could buy. "You did this yourself?" Jacques asked, noting the hand-painted murals on the walls. Simple but charming animals that looked like they'd been created with love rather than professional skill. "YouTube is an amazing teacher," Tim said with a self-deprecating smile. "Turns out I'm not terrible with a paintbrush when I actually slow down and focus on what I'm doing." Jaime was already exploring, pulling books from shelves and investigating toy boxes with the systematic thoroughness of a tiny archaeologist. "Dada, you have my bear," he exclaimed, holding up a stuffed animal identical to the worn teddy he'd clutched at the airport. "I thought you might want to have Bear here too," Tim explained, "so you'd have a friend when you visit." Jacques felt tears threatening again. Every detail of this room, of this house, of Tim's new life spoke of a man who had genuinely transformed himself. Not for show, not to win her back, but because losing them had taught him what actually mattered. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly while Jaime was distracted by a particularly fascinating puzzle. They sat on Tim's front porch with coffee and comfortable silence that comes from knowing someone well enough to not need constant conversation. Jaime played in the small front yard, chasing butterflies and narrating his adventures in the running commentary style of imaginative toddlers. "I read your letters," Jacques said finally. Tim's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. "I didn't think you were opening them anymore." I wasn't until 2 weeks ago when I found them all in a box and read every single one. She turned to study his profile, noting the way his jaw tightened with what might have been embarrassment or fear. You really meant it, didn't you? About letting me go if that's what would make me happy? Of course I meant it. Tim's voice was rough with emotion. Jacques, losing you and Jaime taught me that love isn't about getting what you want. It's about wanting what's best for the people you love, even if that doesn't include you. And what if what's best for us is being with you? The question hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they dared to cross. Tim set down his coffee cup with shaking hands. Is it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Because I've spent 4 months learning to live without you, learning to accept that I missed my chance. I don't think I could survive hoping again, only to lose you a second time. I broke up with Antoine, Jacques said quietly. Tim went very still. What? Last week, after I read your letters and realized that I was about to marry a good man for all the wrong reasons. Jacques reached for Tim's hand, lacing their fingers together and marveling at how perfectly they still fit. I was choosing safety over happiness, security over love. I was so afraid of being hurt again that I was willing to settle for a life that felt like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. Jacques, I came here to test you, she admitted, to see if the man who wrote those letters was real or just another beautiful promise that would disappear when life got complicated. I came here expecting to find you back in your penthouse, back to your old patterns, maybe with a new woman who didn't come with messy complications. And instead I find you living in a neighborhood where families build tree houses, volunteering with sick children, creating art therapy programs for people who need hope more than money. Jacques' voice broke slightly. I find a man who painted murals for a son who might never see them, who learned to put love before ambition because losing us taught him what actually mattered. Tim brought their joined hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. I'm not the same man who broke your heart, Jacques. I can't be. Losing you and Jaime broke me so completely that I had to rebuild myself from scratch. What I became in that rebuilding process is someone who understands that you and Jaime are my real success story, my only empire that actually matters. Prove it, Jacques whispered, echoing the challenge she'd issued 3 years ago in his penthouse. How? Choose us. Every day, in every decision, for the rest of our lives. Choose us when business calls and family needs you. Choose us when it's inconvenient and messy and complicated. Choose us the way you never learned to choose us before. Tim cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she didn't realize she'd been crying. I choose you, Jacques Canepa. I choose you and Jaime, and the life we can build together. I choose love over everything else, today and every day, for the rest of my life. When he kissed her, it felt like coming home and starting a new adventure all at the same time. Familiar passion mixed with the deeper intimacy of two people who had been broken and healed and were brave enough to try again. Chapter 10. Everything changes love, Tim Alstrom discovered in the most beautiful and brutal way possible, was not a destination you arrived at, but a choice you made new every single day. And Jacques Canepa intended to ensure he understood exactly what that choice would cost him. 6 months had passed since that life-changing afternoon on his front porch. 6 months of rebuilding trust, one careful moment at a time. They were living together now in Tim's Denver house, but Jacques had made it clear that sharing an address didn't mean sharing a future. Not yet. The first test came on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. Tim was making pancakes while Jamie built elaborate towers with his blocks, chattering about the airplane he'd seen outside his bedroom window. Jacques sat at the kitchen table working on grant applications for the children's art program she'd started at Denver General Hospital. "Tim," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "I need to fly to New York tomorrow. There's a potential major donor who wants to meet in person about expanding the art therapy program nationwide." "That's fantastic," Tim replied, flipping pancakes with the casual expertise he'd developed over months of breakfast duty. "What time is your flight?" "I can drive you to the airport." "Actually, I was hoping you could come with me. Jaime, too. Make it a family trip." Jacques watched Tim's face carefully. "The only problem is your board meeting is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon, the one where you're presenting quarterly projections to potential investors." Tim's hand stilled on the spatula. For a moment, Jacques saw the old Tim flicker across his features, the man who would have immediately started calculating the cost of missing such an important meeting. Then Tim smiled, reaching for his phone. Jennifer, he corrected himself, still occasionally slipping back to his old assistant's name. "Can you reschedule tomorrow's board meeting? Family emergency." "Tim, you don't have to," Jacques started. "Yes, I do," Tim interrupted gently, pulling her against his side as he continued the phone call. "Jennifer, I don't care if we have to push it back 2 weeks. My family needs me in New York tomorrow, so that's where I'll be." The second test came 3 weeks later, more subtle but equally revealing. Jaime woke up with a fever and that particular clingy misery that only sick toddlers could achieve. Jacques had deliberately scheduled an early morning conference call with donors in London, a call that couldn't be rescheduled due to time zones. "Go," Tim said when she hesitated at Jaime's bedroom door. "I've got him. But you have that presentation to the Nakamura executives this morning. The contract renewal worth $30 million. I know exactly how much it's worth, and it's not worth more than taking care of our boy when he's sick." Jacques found herself blinking back tears as she watched Tim settle into the rocking chair beside Jaime's bed, their fevered son immediately curling against his father's chest. "Daddy sing," Jaime mumbled into Tim's shirt. "Summertime, like the storm night." Tim's voice, rough with emotion and lack of sleep, filled the quiet room with the same jazz standard he'd sung during that thunderstorm months ago. The Nakamura executives could wait. The business world could wait. Love was happening in a child's bedroom, and for the first time in her life, Jacques knew with absolute certainty that it would always come first. But the final test, the one that would determine whether they had a future together, came on an ordinary Thursday that started with extraordinary news. "I got it," Jacques announced, bursting through the front door with Jaime on her hip and excitement radiating from every pore. "The Musée d'Art Moderne in Paris. They offered me the position, head curator for their new children's education program." Tim looked up from his laptop, where he'd been reviewing reports from his foundation directors, and felt his world shift on its axis. "Paris? It's everything I've ever dreamed of professionally. A chance to build something revolutionary from the ground up. Unlimited budget. Complete creative control." Jacques set Jaime down and moved toward Tim, her eyes bright with possibility and something that might have been challenge. "They want me to start in 3 months. That's incredible, Jacques. You'd be amazing at that." Tim closed his laptop slowly, his mind racing through implications and complications. How long would the position be? 5 years minimum, with the possibility of permanent residency if the program succeeds. Jacques sat on the couch beside him, close enough to touch but far enough away to maintain the emotional distance that would make this conversation possible. "Tim, this is my dream job. The kind of opportunity that comes once in a lifetime." "I know." Tim reached for her hand, marveling at how natural the gesture had become, how right it felt to anchor himself to her touch when his world was spinning. "You have to take it." "Do I?" Jacques' voice was quiet, but Tim heard the test beneath the question, the challenge that would define the rest of their lives. What about your business, your foundation, everything you've built here? This was it, the moment Tim had been preparing for without knowing it, the ultimate choice between the empire he'd spent his adult life building and the love that had taught him what actually mattered. There are competent people running both the business and the foundation, Tim said slowly, thinking through possibilities he'd never allowed himself to consider. The beauty of building good systems is that they can function without constant oversight. Tim, I'm not asking you to give up your life's work for me. I'm asking you to choose what matters most to you. You are what matters most to me, Tim said without hesitation. You and Jaime. Everything else is just details, even if it means selling your companies, starting over in a foreign country where you don't speak the language and have no business connections. Tim was quiet for a long moment, and Jacques held her breath, waiting to see whether the man she'd fallen in love with all over again would choose love or revert to the ambitious stranger who had broken her heart. I've been thinking about selling anyway, Tim said finally. Not because I have to, but because I want to. I want to focus on things that actually change people's lives instead of just generating profit. Maybe starting over somewhere new is exactly what I need. You'd really do that. Give up everything you've built here to move to Paris with us. Tim cupped her face in his hands, looking into her eyes with an intensity that took her breath away. Jacques, you and Jaime are everything I've built that actually matters. The rest is just money and buildings and deals that will be forgotten in a generation. But the love we're building together, the family we're creating, that's the only legacy I care about leaving behind. The kiss that followed was different from all the others they'd shared since reuniting, deeper, more desperate, filled with the weight of a decision that would change everything. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, both understanding that they'd just crossed a line from which there would be no retreat. There's something else, Jacques whispered against his lips, something I haven't told you. What? The museum position comes with a beautiful apartment in the Marais district. 3 bedrooms, hardwood floors, windows that overlook a courtyard where children play every afternoon. Her smile was radiant, transformative. I may have already told them that my partner would be joining me and that we'd need space for our son. Tim felt his heart stop completely. Your partner? Well, Jacques said, her voice teasing but her eyes serious. I was hoping you might want to make that official before we move to Paris. Jaime's been asking why some of his friends' parents have the same last name when we don't. Tim was off the couch and down on one knee before she had finished speaking, pulling the ring box from his pocket, the same ring he had purchased 3 years ago but had been too afraid to offer, the same ring he had carried every day since their reunion, in case this moment ever came. Jacques connaît pas, he said, his voice rough with emotion and hope, and the absolute certainty that this was the most important negotiation of his life. Will you marry me? Will you let me love you and he me for the rest of our lives? Will you trust me to choose you every single day, no matter what else the world offers me? Yes, she whispered, tears streaming down her face as he slipped the ring onto her finger. A perfect fit, just like everything else about their hard-won love. Yes to all of it. Jaime, who had been playing quietly with his blocks during this life-changing conversation, looked up at the sound of his mother's tears. Mama, crying. Happy tears, baby, Jacques managed, pulling their son into the embrace that Tim was already wrapping around both of them. Mama's crying because she's so happy. Daddy staying? Jaime asked, his small hands patting Tim's face with the serious concern of a child who had learned not to take his father's presence for granted. Forever, Tim promised, pressing a kiss to his son's forehead. Daddy's staying forever and ever. 3 months later, they stood in a small chapel in the Latin Quarter of Paris, surrounded by new friends from the museum and old friends who had flown in from New Orleans and Denver. Jaime served as ring-bearer with the solemn importance of a 2-year-old who understood he was part of something magical. As Jacques walked down the aisle in a simple white dress that made her look like an angel, Tim understood that this moment represented the complete transformation of everything he'd once thought he wanted. The old Tim had measured success in dollars and deals, in power accumulated and empires built. This Tim measured success in morning kisses and bedtime stories, in the trust shining in his son's eyes, and the love radiating from the woman who had taught him what actually mattered. "I choose you," he whispered when they exchanged vows, echoing the promise he'd made on his front porch 6 months earlier. "Today and every day for the rest of our lives, I choose you, and I choose you," Jacques replied, her voice strong and clear and filled with the hard-won wisdom of a woman who had learned that real love was worth fighting for. "I choose the man you've become, the father you are, the partner you've proven yourself to be." When they kissed as husband and wife, with Jaime giggling at their feet and afternoon sun streaming through stained glass windows, Tim felt something click into place in his chest. The final piece of a puzzle he had been trying to solve his entire adult life. He had everything now. Not the everything he'd once thought he wanted, but the everything that actually mattered. A wife who challenged him to be better, a son who looked at him like he hung the moon, and a love that had survived his worst mistakes and grown stronger in the breaking and healing. The billionaire who had once believed that money could buy anything had discovered the one thing that couldn't be purchased at any price. A love that chose to stay, to forgive, to build something beautiful from the wreckage of old dreams. And as Tim Alstrom danced with his new wife in a Parisian chapel, while their son clapped along to the music, he finally understood what it meant to be truly, completely, impossibly wealthy.